so they can't go on, I guess.
Yeah, so the march is stopped at the moment. So that's a really good question. Who can make a change? Because what we see, the governments are working, collaborating with the people of power, the people who have money. The question is, who can make the change? We are those who can make the change. So how to make the change? First of all, the change has to happen here and it has to happen here. Because we all have the power, we just have to know how to emerge with this power. This is why we are having this meeting here today. So this is Zuzia from Czas, and this is Niels from Extinction Rebellion. And we would really like to hear what Niels would like to say about the movement in UK. Have you heard about Extinction Rebellion? Yes. Okay.
Did you want to show the...
Yeah, I wanted to show the video. Not many have seen it, as I understand, so we can watch it. It's like a video that shows a bit what Extinction Rebellion is about and how
it's
it was
a bit behind the scenes.
Organized. Yeah, a bit behind the scenes, and it's pretty funny.
An important point, see the difference between the police in Poland and the police in UK. It's something worth seeing.
So sort of showing a bit all the sort of the actions that we did in November, sort of this month earlier. And I think as I sort of showed in the beginning, sort of when we was going to do a talk, we sort of started working on this, or started organizing this. We're doing a sort of standard talk that we went to sort of on tour with across the UK. So from spring last year over the summer and sort of beginning of the autumn, we did, I think, 65 to 70 talks in sort of town halls and at festivals and in universities and both big and small cities. And then it's also showed sort of after the talk doing this sort of follow-up, or sort of giving out the phone, sort of asking people if you're up for getting arrested or going to prison or help with the organization. And okay.
Yeah. No, you can go on.
And so this, I think we had a sort of we were laughing quite a lot when you sort of first saw it, when it got first released. Partly because it sort of shows like quite sort of different, like, or sort of shows the Extinction Rebellion in quite a sort of different light compared to all of our sort of other communications and all the other sort of films and all this. I think both in a good way, we sort of both have this sort of, I think as it was mentioned, Extinction Rebellion was set up by a sort of network called Rising Up, which had been a sort of quite small organization, was sort of first set up in 2016 by a group of people who had both done research on sort of how social movements and uprisings work. And Roger Hallam, who was sort of part of sort of the main character in the film, he was sort of part of setting it up. And then there was also Gail Bradbrook, who was sort of up on the roof spray painting frack off. She was also one of sort of initial people setting it up. She was set up initially by some people who sort of had the idea that we sort of, the sort of campaign that is being done, at least in the UK, are not really sort of innovating that much, or are not really sort of leading forward. It felt like got so much sort of stuck in their ways. So they found Rising Up in order to sort of like try out new things, both work a lot through the sort of what research has shown works or not works, and also to sort of work with more sort of theories of change, like several people who sort of ended up had a quite sort of spiritual approach, and they wanted to sort of like have a sort of group or network where that sort of approach is sort of accepted or sort of endorsed, not sort of mandatory that everyone sort of has to sign up on it, but sort of wanted to sort of have that like approach part of it or sort of alive in it as well. And so we had done, I was part of Rising Up for maybe 1.5 years or so before we sort of started setting up the Extinction Rebellion in May this year. So we had a quite sort of good foundation of a sort of like core group of 10-20 people who had been doing different actions and different small campaigns of a variety of issues, and like trying things out, see how things work. So we had a sort of fairly good Okay, so anyway, I was just sort of going through a little bit sort of background of Extinction Rebellion, sort of where it came from. And to those who weren't here, it was set up by this sort of group or network called Rising Up. It was sort of forming in sort of early 2016 by sort of researchers and people who sort of wanted to work with sort of other theories of change and wanting sort of like try out new things because they could sort of see that sort of campaigning sort of world in the UK had been a bit sort of stuck in their sort of ways of doing things. So they set up Rising Up as a way of like experimenting with things. And so in May 2018, sort of May early this year, sort of a lot of us sort of came together and started working on the Extinction Rebellion. And so we had sort of a fairly good like foundation of people when we set it out, because we had just sort of like a core group of 10-15 people who was only setting up, who had already been working together and built a bit of sort of community, a bit of trust, and we sort of knew each other a bit, and we had some like basic infrastructure, some basic structure when we started. So the way we sort of started building up the Extinction Rebellion was to sort of do sort of standard talk of 1 hour, which we sort of went out with across the UK, both in sort of town halls and in small and big cities and universities and festivals. So I was going to run through a sort of, I think, slightly scaled down version of that talk, or that sort of introductory talk, because I think sort of that gives quite sort of good picture of how sort of a lot of people sort of came in touch with the Extinction Rebellion for the first time, and it also sort of outlines a bit our sort of like I think the sort of core bits of Extinction Rebellion. Do you want to do?
Yeah, next slide. Sure. Wait.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the talk is called sort of Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It, and it's sort of structured in 2 parts. The first one going into sort of ecological crisis and trying to sort of like give quite a sort of accurate picture of how the sort of situation actually looks like, not trying to sort of shy over or sort of the seriousness of the crisis. And then part 2 talking about how we can sort of work with it, or what we can sort of do about it, talking a bit about the sort of history and research behind civil disobedience and how we can sort of relate to it emotionally. And so one of the things we've been trying to sort of work with is sort of make space for grief, and so see it as a sort of essential part of being human, and we see it as a quite sort of something that we need to like face and work through as both human beings and as a sort of wider movement as well, in order to sort of work through these and progress collectively. So when we're talking about climate change, we very much want to sort of bring in this thing about sort of precautionary principle, which means that as sort of climate scientists can say that they sort of have a certain amount of like security, they can say, oh, we know this is true to like 70% secure. But I think as policymakers are more sort of concerned about sort of precautionary principles, like meaning if there is a sort of chance that something really serious is going to happen, like for example if there is a 5% chance that the airplane you're going on is going to crash, then you would sort of never allow anyone to go on that airplane. But still we're sort of taking that risk to some degree with climate change, because no one is really applying the precautionary principle to that. We know we're facing huge risks. Like scientists can say, oh, it's just a sort of 5-7% risk that we're sort of heading for catastrophe, but still, as if we sort of wanted to adopt a precautionary principle, then that's quite serious. And we're also trying to sort of look on the sort of climate science that is sort of in between the most alarmist and the most conservative. So looking at sort of IPCC at one end, who have a panel with economists and business people who sort of have an influence in saying sort of what reports the IPCC is putting out there. And then on the other hand, looking at sort of more alarmist climate scientists who are being sort of accused of nitpicking the worst scenarios. But sort of in between there's a sort of also a body of research who is not sort of following sort of conservative estimates of the IPCC, but still have some really good like rigor to it. And so this is just one example. You can see the sort of thick line going down towards 2100 is showing the sort of IPCC's model of sort of how quickly they're sort of expecting the Arctic ice to melt. And the red graph that you can see is going sharply down is sort of the actual observations of how quickly the ice melts. So you can see there's a bit of dissonance between what the sort of IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is sort of expecting, or what their models looks like, compared to sort of actual observations of how quickly ice is melting. And so one thing that sort of isn't in the IPCC that much is this thing about sort of tipping points and positive feedback loops. Like it's basically like climate change can be in a bit of a sort of non-linear scenario, and it's a bit of a sort of unexpected thing. Like there's a lot of these sort of tipping points that scientists know is there, but they don't know for sort of exactly certain when you sort of hit a certain tipping point or hit a certain threshold. Like you sort of know that they're there, but can't sort of say exactly for sure when it's going to happen. So because of this sort of unpredictability of sort of feedback loops and tipping points, it's not necessarily sort of that often incorporated in the IPCC models. So you have this like huge variability here that sort of the sort of big climate change models is not sort of taking into account that much. And so one of these tipping points or positive feedback loops is the melting of the Arctic sea ice. So this again is a sort of graph of how fast the sort of melting of the Arctic ice is actually going. And considering that, they have made sort of a few different projections of when we can sort of first see a sort of ice-free Arctic. And it's estimated that it will be sort of between, it could be as soon as 5 years or sort of as late as 10 years, but it's sort of within that time period. So in about sort of 5 to 10 years, we can sort of estimate that the Arctic will be ice-free in the summer months for the first time. And that sort of kicks off one of these positive feedback loops known as the albedo effect, which basically means that sort of when the ice is sort of covering the sea in the Arctic, it's reflecting a lot of light. But as the sort of ice melts and sort of give way for the dark ocean water, suddenly you get a sort of dark surface that starts absorbing a lot of heat. And so you get this sort of self-reinforcing heating, like sort of as the ice melts, you sort of get an increased amount of heating because less light is being reflected out. And I think also in the Arctic it sort of faces a lot of sun during the summer months. And so this is also, we know there's sort of several different of these tipping points, like another sort of Amazon rainforest, because sort of as the sort of climate gets warmer and sort of more parts of sort of Amazon starts burning down, or sort of we get more forest fires, which is another sort of self-reinforcing loop, because as more forests burn down we sort of get another increase in temperature on Earth, and even more forest is burning down. And another one is sort of permafrost in the Siberia, which I think is also quite well known. But again, a lot of these are sort of, scientists know they're there, but not sort of exactly when they're gonna strike. But some of them we sort of definitely know are gonna hit quite soon, like for example with Arctic sea ice. And yeah, as it was also released a report quite recently that at the moment we have about sort of 1% chance of reaching the target outlined in the Paris Agreement to sort of stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. And that's sort of the targets within the sort of IPCC, which we know is sort of a bit conservative estimates. And I think I've heard it's like just a handful of countries across the world have sort of actually made promises that is sort of in alignment with the IPCC or with these targets. So at the moment we're sort of looking at hitting somewhere between sort of 2 and 4.9 degrees Celsius of global warming, and sort of roughly the sort of median in there is about 3.2 degrees. And you sort of can say for certain that sort of at that level we're sort of facing quite big consequences. Like a lot of these sort of positive feedback loops are quite certain to sort of kick in at that level. Yeah, and this affects people all over the place. We're also sort of making the case that it's also going to hit a lot of people even within the UK. We could be looking at sort of 10% of people sort of even within the UK being internally displaced if we sort of get a massive sea level increase, because there's sort of lots of cities along the coast that are sort of looking at getting flooded. And another and yeah, we're also very much sort of not framing the sort of issue just in terms of climate change. I'm sort of very much aware there's sort of a lot of other ecological crises that are affecting us or could have sort of equally serious consequences. Like for example about species extinction. There was also released a big report from the UN, I think a couple of months ago. Like if we don't sort of reverse the trend of species extinction within 2 years, then we're sort of equally facing a sort of collapse of human civilization as well as we do from climate change. So we're sort of very much of looking at the wider ecological crisis rather than just sort of focusing on climate change. And that is partly because we're sort of facing so many other crises other than that. And we know, we're also talking about sort of, as a contrast watch, we're also trying to sort of talking about sort of possibility of human extinction. And we know sort of very big sort of extinction event has happened in the past, a lot due to rapid increases in sort of Earth's temperature. Like one of these sort of big extinction events has happened was sort of likely due to a meteor, but a lot of the other ones are sort of, I think it's fairly certain that they happened because there was this rapid release of CO2. Back then it was because of volcanoes erupting, but now we're sort of doing the same but burning fossil fuels. And in the sort of worst of these events we lost sort of about 97% of all life forms on Earth. Yeah, and this, again, this is also going into the precautionary principle. Like this was a scientific paper released not that long ago, who is also saying that we have, that is about sort of 1 in 20 chance today that sort of the carbon that we have emitted into the atmosphere is going to sort of lead us into a sort of never-ending slope, or like that we already passed the threshold and that we sort of have no other option of reversing it, and the sort of feedback will just reinforce itself. And so we know that even if we're sort of limiting at a sort of 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, we already know that that's a sort of extremely dangerous situation. Like even sort of progressing from where we are today is sort of extremely dangerous, because this sort of precautionary principle, as I mentioned before, has not been applied. Like we're already sort of facing a sort of 5% chance that, as I mentioned, the sort of plane we're about to sort of go on board is gonna crash, and it's would have been sort of unthinkable for a sort of aviation company to sort of take that risk with human life, but still that's the sort of risk that is being taken today. And yeah, we've sort of seen that people have sort of known about climate change since sort of 1990s, and negotiations has been going on for sort of 24 years now. And sort of since 1990, since we start sort of first being aware of the problem, the sort of CO2 levels have risen by 60%. And also you see the sort of graph here to the right, like with the sort of global warmings, a lot of these things sort of grow exponentially. Like for a long time you might sort of just see the sort of growth growing very, very slowly like here, but once you start sort of realizing that you sort of things are actually sort of kicking off and going seriously, then you have a sort of very short space of time to sort of act before it just goes off or sort of grows on an exponential curve. And this is what a climate scientist called Kate Marvel was saying and she was sort of saying that as a sort of climate scientist, she's always sort of asked to sort of give people hope, or sort of people want sort of like hear something encouraging from her, in sort of contrast towards sort of campaigners and everyone else is saying sort of situation is so bad. But that her reply often is that sort of that she can't really sort of give any hope, but she's more sort of encouraging people to sort of step into a place of courage instead, and describing courage as a sort of resolve to sort of do the right thing, even though you're not sure about how it's going to make out, how it's going to end up. Like hope is a bit more sort of doing something because you think it will sort of work out well in the end, but she's encouraging people sort of work more with courage instead of sort of doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, even though we might sort of not be sure about how it ends up, or sort of if we're going to succeed in the end. And yes, but he sort of say you should sort of encourage like 1 or 2 minutes silence, because it's quite a sort of lot to take in a sort of short space of time. I think he's just gonna have 1 or 2 minutes of silence and then go on. Can you hear me okay, or shall I speak up more?
Yeah.
Okay? Good. I can go on. So this is sort of second part of the talk, where we're trying to sort of go more into sort of how we can both sort of practical tools that we can do in terms of like campaigning or sort of working sort of something like this, but also how we sort of like the sort of emotional side of things, how we sort of gear ourselves, sort of set us up sort of emotionally and sort of like deal with the future to some extent. And so Stephen Jenkinson is talking about a sort of death-phobic culture, like in a sort of culture today, sort of death is to very much sort of extent like being avoided or trying to sort of be ignored. But I think we are more sort of seeing it as sort of just by, I think it's only by really sort of acknowledging the sort of human mortality and sort of that we can sort of know that we are, or know how to sort of be truly alive to some extent. And it's sort of by sort of recognizing that we can sort of fully like step into what it means of being human. And so yesterday evening I was sort of down in Katowice and having a sort of panel discussion with some other people from Climate Camp and from other groups. And one thing that was sort of being asked a lot was to sort of, to what extent you can use like these form of apocalyptic messaging that sort of things are really, really bad. To what extent can you sort of motivate people to sort of engage with it if you sort of telling sort of full extent of it. And we've sort of been like we very much be sort of setting out sort of tell the truth in sort of quite plain everyday language. And part of that comes back to, again, we're sort of not necessarily trying to sort of motivate people by hope alone, since, you know, since like I said, we sort of can't really sort of guarantee that. So we're trying to sort of work with other ways of like motivating people or sort of working through this. And I think and thus again we sort of trying to gather myself. And so we're very much sort of trying to work with the sort of idea that sort of we know that the sort of people out there who sort of knows that the sort of we're in a sort of really serious situation and sort of would be prepared to sort of act in a quite sort of very passionate and very sort of engaging way. So what we've been trying to do is not necessarily trying to sort of mobilize a lot of people to do a sort of small thing or small ask. We're not necessarily trying to sort of motivate millions and millions of people to sort of donate a bit of money or sort of sign a petition or go on a march. What we've been trying to do is to sort of like find this sort of these people are sort of like really resonate with the sort of like doing the right thing, even though it's not necessarily going to be successful, because we believe that there is sort of other ways of doing campaigning as well. You could potentially sort of create a lot of change or a lot of leverage even with just a sort of small amount of people, a sort of fairly small amount of people, if they're sort of willing to sort of make sacrifices as being arrested, as sort of risking imprisonment. And again, it sort of also comes down to sort of asking ourselves what it sort of means to be human to some extent, as how we sort of live our lives in this sort of period of time when sort of world's most powerful governments is sort of taking huge risks with all our lives and with human society. And so we've been asking ourselves sort of what is an appropriate response to this situation. Again, some of sort of big like tools within campaigning, like going on marches or signing letters or writing to members of parliament, might be sort of appropriate when you sort of, maybe when you're working on some sort of smaller issue, if you want sort of more green spaces in your local town or save to sort of campaign to save a local park, then maybe those things are more appropriate, sort of go on a march and write to your member of parliament or others. But we're sort of seeing that if we really want to sort of communicate the crisis with sort of wider part of the population, then we need to sort of take appropriate action, because we sort of believe that you can't really sort of go on saying sort of year after year sort of, oh, the situation is really bad, we're gonna sort of lose, millions of people are gonna be flooded and it's gonna be quite severe, and then just sort of go on doing the things that you've always been doing. It's like organizing another march or sort of organizing another petition, because people will sort of see that you can't really sort of communicate an emergency with people unless you yourself or you as a group sort of start acting as if that emergency is real and sort of taking an appropriate response. And so we've also started sort of planning a rebellion, because seeing a sort of rebellion is sort of only appropriate response in this situation, and it's something that has been recognized across the sort of political spectrum, at least within the sort of English-speaking world. Like even sort of liberal political thinkers and conservative political thinkers have embraced the sort of idea that citizens have the right to rebel if the government is not protecting their lives. So that is seen as a quite sort of universal right for people to do. And saying that this is very much sort of situation we're in. And so this information here is a bit out of date at the moment, but you sort of, we're basically trying sort of, when you're doing these talks, giving people like a few months ahead to sort of plan, sort of take time out. We always had the sort of date of like, we're doing the declaration of rebellion on the 31st of October and then having a big rebellion day on the 17th of November. Those days we had sort of set quite early on in the campaign. So when we're doing these talks across the country, we could sort of tell to people, if you want to sort of be involved with this or take action, we have these days, and then you can sort of structure your life around it. And I think that also helped quite a lot to have a bit of a sort of build-up phase, like people knew from quite a long time that these were the sort of big days, and that allows people to sort of take the time out of their lives to sort of sort out their commitments. And again, we sort of this was very much sort of planned as one iteration, like trying it out to sort of see how this model that we were trying to work with actually works, and sort of then taking some time and debrief and reflect on it, and then planning to sort of build towards another iteration in April 15th, sort of 2019, because sort of like I've always seen it quite important, sort of starting something out and then sort of like seeing how it goes, rather than spending a lot of time trying to sort of build something perfect, or like sort of perfect movement, sort of realizing it's never going to be perfect, and what we want to do is like just get something out there quite soon and then sort of see how it goes, reflect on it, take feedback from how it actually works. And then at the moment we're in a bit of a sort of restructuring process, because we sort of started this process in May 2018 when we had sort of a fairly small group of people, and now we had a big expansion of people, and we sort of could see that there was some tensions around, so it's like working on restructuring this so that we then can build towards a sort of new iteration towards the spring, and again sort of give people a sort of like time ahead, sort of plan, sort of take time off their lives, so sort of setting up things. And one of the immediate aims we have had with doing this rebellion has partly been sort of shift the Overton window, or sort of shifting the window of acceptable public discourse around climate change and ecological crisis. And we saw how Donald Trump did a sort of shifting the Overton window to the right when he was saying outrageous things about sort of banning Muslims from the US and doing very outrageous things towards sort of far right. What he sort of did to some extent was to sort of shift the window of sort of public discussion very far to the right, because it made sort of previous attitudes that I have sort of seen as quite radical before suddenly seem sort of more sensible and less unthinkable. And so we've attempted to do something by sort of shifting the window around climate change, sort of saying that human extinction is a real possibility, and we could have sort of passed the threshold of no return, and then sort of hoping that sort of window of discussion is sort of changing more our way, so that previous ideas or previous discussion around climate change could be seen as less unthinkable and more sensitive. And so that's one of our like immediate aims, apart from like getting the government to the negotiating table and sort of implementing things. That has been seen as one of sort of like things we can sort of achieve in the sort of immediate term, like getting the sort of image out and sort of changing the public discussion. Elisabeth?
Yeah.
Yes, on to the next one. So one of our sort of inspirations that we have had has been the sort of Freedom Riders campaign, which sort of happened in the American civil rights movement in the 1960s, which basically consisted of young people sort of traveling on the sort of define the sort of segregation laws on public buses, basically going to, I think it was Birmingham, Alabama, sort of knowing that once they sort of arrived there they would be sort of put in prison basically, because some people started it going there and they ended up there and sort of got put in prison. And that sort of caused a big outrage, and then suddenly sort of more and more people started sort of going on the buses, defying the segregation laws, and as soon as they arrived being put in prison. So during a few months over a summer, basically sort of, I think 320, 330 people got put in prison in the American South. And one thing it did was it sort of caused a sort of big outrage across the US, and it sort of basically managed to sort of affect policy change through having this sort of display of public sacrifice, just sort of images of young people sort of from all across the US being willing, sort of like going to Birmingham, Alabama and being put in prison. And so we could sort of see that with the sort of few hundred people sort of willing to risk imprisonment, they managed to sort of shift policy change in the US, a country with sort of several 100 million inhabitants. So part of what we have sort of been trying to do is to sort of have a fairly small amount of people, like under 200 people, are sort of willing to risk imprisonment in the UK, with the hope of that sort of being a possibility of affecting national policy change. And there has been research made showing that for uprisings or revolutions to succeed, what is needed is sort of 3.5% of the population to be in sort of active and sustained support. Like for example, in the Arab Spring at Tahrir Square in Cairo, there was sort of at most 1 million people in the square, whereas there's sort of 20 million people living in sort of Greater Cairo area and about 90 million people living in Egypt. So they managed to sort of bring down the regime with sort of very limited part of the population in what you call like active and sustained support. And so we're working with a sort of theory a bit that perhaps we can sort of create big policy change with a sort of even smaller amount of people, but people are willing to sort of make a big sacrifice of sort of stepping up to that ask. And in, you know, could probably sort of look differently in sort of different countries. I think sort of something very different sort of be arrested or be like, we were trying to sort of get people put in prison on remand for a week, because sort of somehow possible we sort of managed to get a few people in sort of prison for a week or so, just in remand while sort of waiting for court. So I think that's sort of ask, or that commitment is probably going to sort of look very different in sort of different countries across the world. Because it's one thing being arrested in the UK, as you saw on the video before, the police are sort of quite civilized. But for example, I don't know how it's like sort of being arrested in Poland, like sort of several other countries around is sort of quite a different thing. So like being put in prison on remand in the UK might sort of mean something else, sort of might not mean sort of getting people into prison in other countries. So that might be a sort of a lot more severe ask. And yeah, one thing that we also sort of, like I got this really interesting sort of short email the other day about a sort of one of the, I think I remember sort of Quakers who was sort of working at the UN, or sort of seen one of our talks and saying sort of like, it's really amazing what you're doing, you're trying to sort of step beyond sort of fear of people, or sort of trying to sort of step beyond people's sort of fear of the consequences in order to sort of do the right thing, which sort of unifies us all. And I think that's sort of to some degree part of what we're trying to do, and part of why we're sort of like having this sort of different approach towards being arrested, like trying to sort of get the message across that it's sort of not necessarily such a sort of really severe thing. Like it's quite a bit sort of a cultural thing, the sort of thing about being arrested or sort of being in prison for a short while. It's not necessarily something really severe. You can sort of choose to look at it different ways. And so we're trying to sort of have that a bit of our approach, very much sort of emphasizing that we do recognize that people get different or treated differently by the sort of police and the justice system, depending on your background. Like we very much sort of acknowledge that people of color or people from sort of foreign countries might get sort of a very different treatment by police and the justice system compared to if you're sort of a white Western European and citizen in the EU. But we're also sort of seeing that you can sort of look at it differently, or sort of have a bit of a different approach and try and sort of step beyond the sort of fear of consequences. And there's also these, I sort of had to look it up a bit. There's also this really amazing footage of another part of sort of civil rights movement. It was sort of Children's March, which was basically also in the 1960s, where a lot of children or young people were sort of going out on the streets and taking part in the sort of big civil disobedience actions, because the other sort of campaigns that sort of got a bit stuck, and one of the sort of local radio DJs was sort of like, we can mobilize all these kids to sort of go out and take action because we really like it. So there's this amazing footage of all of these sort of young kids basically sort of pouring out of classrooms because suddenly they're sort of seen that going to prison was like a cool thing, because all their friends were doing it, like all the sort of cool radio DJs saying like, go to prison, that was like cool. And it's sort of quite amazing to see they sort of had no fear for it. They sort of like transcended that. They were just like, this is the thing to do, this is the thing that is gonna sort of create change and sort of break the segregation. So you can look it up. Next. So I'm also gonna show a bit or sort of few pictures of the actions that we did. Some of it might skip since you saw some of it on the video. But this was one of the first actions we did as Extinction Rebellion, where we were occupying the offices of Greenpeace UK, because we've sort of been in meetings or negotiations with them for a good number of months, sort of saying like, we really like what you're doing, Greenpeace, but you need to sort of step up what you're doing, and can you we're trying out this new thing that can really sort of potentially have an impact on the sort of ecological crisis, but we're asking for you to like let your membership know, sort of send out a sort of email to all your sort of email subscribers, let them know what we're doing and encourage them to take part. So that was our ask, because we're seeing that if they had done that, that could have a sort of big impact on our success if Greenpeace would have spread the message. But they were sort of not really wanting to do that, so we did this occupation. We did it in a really friendly way, sort of bringing flowers to them and sort of reading out sort of love letters saying sort of Greenpeace we love you, and really sort of trying to persuade them, both as a sort of way of like pushing the negotiations a little bit, and also like partly to like shift the public thinking about seeing the sort of like Greenpeace being sort of seen as this radical group being sort of challenged by sort of other people from sort of further out in the spectrum. And this, we might sort of be able to skip some of these because I sort of saw the video, but this again is sort of declaration of rebellion, where we sort of managed to get a lot of these people. They just sort of showed up on the day because they just sort of heard about it. We managed to get sort of, I think at least 500 people or so sort of walk out on the street and sort of sit down on the street for a number of hours, which at least to me felt very inspiring, sort of get these sort of people who are just showing up for the day and not necessarily sort of being really sort of into and be really passionate, still sort of having the courage to sort of step out on the street and sort of take part in law breaking. And this again is Gail, who's sort of one of the people who helped set it up. And again, that's also part of our sort of part of our attempts of like telling the truth about climate change and trying to sort of like reverse it, sort of telling the truth in quite sort of plain everyday language, and sort of using a sort of slightly different narrative. And this again, we're doing a lot of spray painting using chalk-based spray paint, which is basically sort of spray paint that washes off, or you can wipe it off with a tissue. So we've been using that quite a lot in sort of actions, because of going out, sort of building and spray painting it in broad daylight, and then sort of staying there and sort of taking the consequences. But then you can sort of very quickly wipe it off, so you get the sort of like really dramatic images of sort of people spray painting a building in sort of broad daylight, and then sort of police coming there and sort of like trying to arrest them, and then having people just sort of quickly wash it off. So we're noticing that you can do these sort of quite a lot of times without necessarily getting people arrested, but you get these sort of like dramatic images around it without necessarily having people having to invest a lot of time in like being arrested and being held in custody and then going to court. Do you want to go next one? And this was again a sort of quick image of some of the central bridges that we were obstructing every day. And also what we did was that we sort of did very publicly sort of go to the police a few days ahead of it and saying sort of, this is what we're gonna do, we're gonna sort of blockade these 5 bridges during sort of 17th of November to basically sort of allow them to have plenty of time to sort of make plans around it so they could sort of reroute emergency vehicles on the day. And their sort of response was sort of, can you please sort of keep yourself just to one bridge or to Westminster Bridge? So even though sort of like we've been getting quite a lot of criticism within the sort of UK activist community for sort of being very friendly and approachable towards the police, whereas the sort of like common advice among sort of activist communities sort of don't speak to the police at all, don't engage with them, don't do anything. But we have much sort of tried to take the approach of like engagement, sort of having conversations and also doing these things. Not sort of compromising with our sort of power or leverage, still sort of like going ahead and sort of doing the thing we had sort of set out to do, taking the 5 bridges, but still sort of like alerting the authorities, this is what we're going to do, and then let them plan around it for emergency services. Because that's something they're sort of trying to attack us with, sort of saying, oh, they have no regard for ambulances and fire engines when they're sort of obstructing traffic. But in reality, we're sort of trying to be very careful, like as soon as sort of notice there's an ambulance or a fire engine sort of stuck where we're sort of holding up traffic, we're sort of quite keen on like letting them through and letting them pass. So that was also a way that if we're sort of doing this, they can't really say that we haven't like giving them any warning or sort of shown like shown regard for. Yeah, these are some more. And what we sort of finished the sort of rebellion day was with on the 17th of November was that we were all gathering in Parliament Square, which is a sort of quite small park or small square just outside Parliament, just across the road, which is sort of like a square where a lot of like protests or demonstrations have been sort of centered around, the focus around. Is sort of like the most famous square, sort of most sort of central square in the UK. And so we gathered there for a ceremony, and a sort of group of interfaith people sort of read out a few prayers, like it was a Muslim woman sort of read that sort of very powerful Muslim prayer. And at the end of the ceremony we sort of started digging up the ground in the park to sort of plant some trees to sort of finish off the day. And it was a really powerful moment, because as they were sort of in the middle of this big circle of thousands of people, as they were in the middle of sort of trying sort of starting to get the spades and sort of dig up the ground in this sort of National Heritage Park, there was some sort of police officers trying to make their way into the centre to sort of try to arrest them and trying to take them away. But all of a sudden sort of everyone was sort of standing up and sort of linking arms and preventing the police from sort of coming into the centre. So there was a really like beautiful moment when this sort of all happened spontaneously, and sort of protecting the people in the middle who were planting the trees in the centre as a ceremonial thing. And so this, after the 17th, our sort of big rebellion day, we sort of noticed that we did sort of get a lot of publicity, a lot of interest, and wanting to sort of like keep building on this, or sort of keep building momentum, and also taking sort of opportunity to try out new things. So one of the things we did was what you're calling swarming, where you basically were having a few different meetup points in London, where sort of people want to sort of come and join us for the day, could sort of come. And then they were obstructing, I think 5 or 6 different roads, some sort of like crucial congestion points, and sort of obstructing the road for about 10 minutes, and then sort of leaving the road and sort of letting some traffic through, and then sort of going back in the road again. So you could sort of let through the more sort of angry drivers, and you can sort of avoid getting arrested. So they were basically having these groups who did this sort of all day during 3 days at these sort of crucial congestion points, as a way of like causing disruption to the capital, as another way of like both getting to publicity and sort of like causing these economic disruption and make it more difficult for the authorities to not pay attention to us. And so you can see on the images, there's both these sort of thick red lines where you can see the sort of congested traffic points, and then you can also see in the sort of contrast the days where there's sort of no swarming happening. And it worked quite well. Sort of, actually, we managed to sort of do this for sort of 3 days in a row, having people out there obstructing traffic, causing major mayhem, but no one getting arrested. And the police were issuing several warnings for the sort of public to sort of not go into central London because of the traffic chaos. And we happened to sort of catch some sort of fairly well-known people in sort of middle of the roadblocks, like some sort of far-right politicians and some far-right comedians who were sort of like getting out of the cars and sort of being really angry, really irate, which sort of on the other hand sort of managed to get us even more publicity, saying like, we got this article saying, oh, Extinction rebellion protest sort of making this sort of really famous right-wing comedian really upset and all of that, so it was quite fun. And
are
then
the swarming still happening? Like, are you still doing it?
No, we did that for 3 days.
Yeah, I've seen.
And this was the following week on sort of 24th of November, we were doing a second rebellion day. And I think by this point we also started to sort of realize that we were both, like a lot of sort of people central to organizing this have been sort of working on this since sort of summer, since the spring, and we started to feel quite exhausted, and we also started noticing that our sort of like organizational structure couldn't really cope with sort of the amount of people or sort of the amount of activity. So we started noticing at sort of beginning of doing these big actions that we sort of really need some time to like restructure and get things right, because otherwise we would sort of either burn ourselves all out or sort of falling out with each other because the sort of structure wasn't right when people would fall out with each other. So we did this funeral procession as a way of like bringing it back to the sort of seriousness of it and bringing it back to the sort of to the grief and sort of the emotional level. Partly sort of make that contrast, because we had sort of done this sort of 3 days of disrupting activity, just sort of disrupting daily life in London. So you want to sort of bring it back to the sort of more serious nature of it and not just sort of piss people off. And also as a way of like bringing that sort of iteration to a bit of a manageable close as well. There's still sort of some actions going on around London, but the sort of big national scale actions or sort of like put on hold a little bit, partly because the sort of like restructuring really need to happen, because otherwise it would just collapse. So we did this funeral procession where we attempted to sort of bury the coffin that people are carrying also in Parliament Square. And again that was sort of like another display of how difficult it can be to sort of get arrested. Like there was sort of me and 3 other people who sort of like started digging a fairly big hole because we were attempting to bury this sort of life-size coffin. So we like started digging this sort of big hole in the middle of a circle of people. But the police were just sort of like pushing us aside and like refusing to arrest anyone. So I was sort of like showing that because they've sort of known that we have had this sort of like open goal of like trying to get people arrested as a sort of part of our tactic. It's also been sort of shown that the police are sort of very unwilling to arrest us. So this was like we were digging out this sort of national heritage park, but like no rest. And so in the end we sort of like decided to take the coffin onto with us during the procession. And we were doing the procession up onto Buckingham Palace, where the sort of British Queen has a residence, and reading out this sort of letter to the Queen asking for the sort of Queen's intervention, sort of for her to sort of make her voice heard and sort of help us to sort of solve the crisis in a way. Trying to sort of like have that like emotional outreach sort of person to person. Like most of us are not really sort of in favor of monarchy, but we still like I think even if you're sort of not in favor of monarchy, this sort of, if you really want to solve this, sort of Queen could have a sort of major impact. Reaction? We haven't gotten a sort of reply from the Queen yet. But it was sort of like, at least want to sort of do that attempt, like trying to sort of reach out emotionally, so the person sort of could have an impact if you sort of want to get involved. So this is just sort of outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, where we sort of left the coffin and we asked people to sort of leave images and flowers and wreaths and memorial objects.
That's the entry.
I think so.
I don't have any more.
Before we jump into the discussion, we would like to show you the movie from our own backyard.
Yeah, about the grassroots movements.
A jaki jest stosunek polskiego rządu do środowiska?
To jest dobry komentarz chyba.
Obecny rząd, jak i chyba wszystkie poprzednie, traktuje środowisko jako totalnie marginalny temat.
W Polsce jest tak, że nie myśli się perspektywicznie, co będzie za 20, 30 czy 50 lat. Nie ma... Myśli się, co będzie od wyborów do wyborów.
W Polsce trochę wróciliśmy do średniowiecza, trzeba przyznać, chociaż nigdy do końca z niego nie wyszliśmy.
Praworządność to jest chyba podstawowy element tego zamachu na konstytucyjne wartości.
To jezioro obniżyło swoje lustro o prawie 5 metrów. My jesteśmy tacy malutcy, a ci, co decydują o tym, czy ta kopalnia będzie, czy nie będzie, naprawdę mają wpływy, pieniądze i tak to wygląda.
Mamy bardzo restrykcyjną ustawę antyaborcyjną.
Nie widzę na razie żadnej jaskółki zmiany. W sensie nie spodziewam się, że ta zmiana przyjdzie od góry. Ta zmiana może przyjść tylko od dołu.
Dość kompromisu w obronie matki ziemi! Dość kompromisu w obronie matki ziemi!
Tak naprawdę pierwsze wyjście moje na ulicę to było dołączenie do szerszego tłumu. Tak? Czyli jeżeli mogę używać prostych słów, to powiem, że to było na że po prostu tak się wściekłam na to, co robi rząd, że wyszłam i dołączyłam do protestu.
Pierwszy protest zablokowaliśmy 2 drogi krajowe w Polsce. Ja nie miałem pojęcia, zablokowałem, wyszłem na ulicę, ludzi ściągnąłem.
Odbywały się pikiety w zasadzie stałe w Sądzie Najwyższym. Takie pikiety wsparcia dla sędziów.
Konstytucja! Konstytucja!
Na początku brałem udział w tych bardziej klasycznych formach protestu, czyli w demonstracjach, w petycji skierowanej do ministra, no ale to nie przyniosło żadnego rezultatu. Więc później, kiedy dowiedziałem się o tym, że będą prowadzone blokady wycinki, to też do tego dołączyłem.
Spotkaliśmy się w lipcu w 2018 roku po raz pierwszy w regionie, w którym gołym okiem można było zobaczyć, jaki jest wpływ wydobywania węgla brunatnego na przyrodę i na społeczności lokalne. Przyjechało 400 osób na obóz, co przekroczyło nasze oczekiwania.
Obóz powstał pod koniec maja 2017 roku. Przez kolejne miesiące przewinęło się przez niego ponad 1000 osób, więc to jest bardzo dużo ludzi, bardzo zróżnicowana grupa z wielu państw w różnym wieku. Nieważne, czy ktoś się realizuje w gotowaniu śniadania, czy ktoś się realizuje w przypinaniu się do harwestera, wszystkie te działania były równie potrzebne. I wszystkie te osoby mogły się w ten sposób jakoś poczuć, że angażują się w obronę Puszczy Białowieskiej przed dewastacją.
Osoby, które do tej pory nie były zainteresowane polityką, życiem publicznym albo nawet może życiem społecznym, po raz pierwszy, nawet w bardzo małych miejscowościach, ruszyły do działania.
Politycy mogą zrobić co chcą. Politycy mogą nam obiecać, że zrobią coś w 2025 roku. A prawda jest taka, że jeżeli w tej chwili politycy nam obiecują, że zrobią coś w 2021, to znaczy, że tego nie zrobią. To znaczy, że zrobi to ktoś inny. Że oni nie muszą tego robić. Że zostawią to komuś innemu. Więc zawsze najważniejsze jest pytanie, co robisz teraz w rządzie?
Społeczeństwo myśli już inaczej niż myślało jeszcze kilkanaście lat temu. Kiedyś na początku byliśmy oszołomani, wyśmiewano nas. W tej chwili jest zupełnie inaczej.
Jeżeli się konsekwentnie będzie stosowało jedną metodę, a tą naszą metodą to jest pokojowe nieposłuszeństwo obywatelskie, to przynosi rezultaty.
Jeżeli jesteśmy w dużej sile, jesteśmy razem i mówimy jednym głosem, to władza słucha. I czarny protest był tego najlepszym dowodem, że duża siła kobiet wypowiedziała się publicznie na ulicy i władza zrobiła krok w tył.
Te działania są skuteczne, co też daje pewną energię. To ludzie, którzy mają w sobie takie głęboko zakorzenione poczucie wolności, w momencie, w którym ta wolność jest im ograniczana, się wkurzają.
Po 5 miesiącach naszego działania harwestery wyjechały z puszczy i do teraz tam nie wróciły. Natomiast kiedy ostatecznie te cięcia ustały, to myślę, że to, co dla mnie było najistotniejsze, to to, że w lesie jest cicho i że wreszcie jakby słychać ten las, słychać te dźwięki, dla których tam wcześniej też przyjeżdżałem i dla których ten las jest wyjątkowy, że tam po prostu można jakby zanurzyć się w tym świecie jakby odległym od człowieka, bez żadnych jego dźwięków, bez ryku pił, bez tych maszyn i tak dalej. I to było bardzo przyjemne i to było na pewno poczucie ulgi.
to się wszystko ze sobą wiąże. Jeżeli chcemy działać na rzecz równości, różnorodności, dobrych warunków życia, to tak naprawdę okazuje się, że jesteśmy po tej samej stronie. Więc dla mnie prawa kobiet, obrona klimatu, prawa mniejszości to są rzeczy absolutnie ze sobą powiązane i jestem zaangażowana we wszystkie.
Czeka nas ogromna zmiana i tak jak możemy ją porównywać do uzyskania praw wyborczych przez kobiety, czy uzyskania wolności przez czarnoskórych niewolników, to jest tego rodzaju przedsięwzięcie, które przed nami czeka. Tego rodzaju przewrót jest przed nami. I te sprawy nie wydarzyły się w ten sposób, że ktoś grzecznie poprosił, a druga strona to dała. Tak się nie wydarzyło w żadnym z tych wypadków.
Jak ludzie biorą sprawy w swoje ręce, to wtedy mają wpływ na polityków, na polityczki, których jest mniej, mają wpływ na różne decyzje, które są podejmowane wokół. Więc tak naprawdę, jeżeli chcesz, żeby coś się wydarzyło, to nie czekaj. Zacznij w takim małym wymiarze i nikt ci nie ma prawa powiedzieć, że robisz to źle, bo robisz. A inni jak nie robią, to sorry. Zamknę się.